that's hopefully what this is about. Not to, like I said, our opening thing as we go in here is the first thing, and I don't know if I covered this enough in our cast, but actually I think this also is worth harping on, is that I actually start by assuming good faith with everyone. And by good faith, I mean I generally assume positive intent by most people. Meaning, so assuming if things could go either way, I generally assume my opponent's not trying to cheat unless I see some sort of repeated behavior, or unless there's something like it's not, it can't go 50-50. So like, think about it. I bump ships. Like, I'm a pretty, like air quotes, like higher level player stuff. I still bump ships. Like I've been playing a lot of Seer Swarm and stuff. Dude, I bump those ships. There's 8 of them. Like you ever just been there and like placed a ship in the wrong spot? Like you were marking a bunch of stuff and then you just like move stuff.
Yeah, or
Like,
you mark a ship and you put the wrong ship back. Mm-hmm.
right. Like that's what I mean by assume positive intent. Like, sure, cheaters at those points can cheat. But like the overwhelming things is that someone just made a mistake or had shaky hands because you're tired. It could be nervousness. We all get nervous. It could be fatigue. It could be caffeine. Like, it could be something. So my thing is assume positive intent. Like, chances are, unless you see some sort of repeated behavior or it's something that's very clear and can't go either way, the safest thing is just assume that they weren't trying to cheat you. Assume positive intent. So you should go into those situations trying to resolve the situation, not assuming it was cheating, but still needing to resolve the situation.
Sure.
So that's what they were trying to remove, the stigma of like calling judges as if you're trying to, that means you're calling your opponent a cheater. No, it's just, I'm trying to resolve a situation that arose. Has nothing to do with like making a judgment on my opponent, if that makes sense. Like, this is a card game thing because you have to call judges so often. It's usually because of interactions. It's just removed. Like, no one actually thinks about it as a judgment on the opponent. But it seems like, I've never really played miniatures, but coming into X-Wing, people really did have that opinion, and they still do, right? So that's what I kind of wanted to bring up here.
And coming from the card game background, like, so I played Magic for a little while, but I never played it like super seriously. I would go to like the Friday Night Magic, and it was always pretty much kind of like a group of friends, and you played at the store. And if you had a question, like, you'd be like, "Hey, whoever's running the store, like, hey, I need you to make this call. Like, what do we do here and there? This rules interaction," and it was never really a big deal. So I never got to see like more of the higher level events interactions. But you're right, because I remember, because for the longest time we had the like fly casual thing, and calling a judge was always like, it had a stigma associated with it. And
I think it still does, as part of the problem. In my opinion, part of the problem.
Yeah, and for me it does too. And that's part of why, like, in my experiences, I need to call judges over more frequently. Like, whenever it's gotten to be like a close arc check, I've just learned, and that's just because of never repetitions. But for other things, I've started to learn from being bit by not calling a judge over that it's kind of like affected the outcome of a game, or it's really kind of put me in a bad situation, just because I was like, I don't want to argue with you, but I don't think you're right, but I don't want to push it, because, that kind of brings us to like the second note that we have, which was the stigma perception of being that guy. And I think that's something that I personally struggle with, because I have a very casual approach when I play people. And sometimes the mood, you can just feel it change when judges get called. And it's not always a bad thing, but I don't want that, and I feel like that's me causing a bad experience. So my natural reaction is to just, whatever, let's just ignore it and let's get along, even though I shouldn't be, because it's negatively affecting my game or my outcome.
So we have to be careful here, right? Because going in, I know that there is a negative stigma to calling judges. So I am effectively saying I am advocating for calling judges more often. And I'm even admitting that calling the judge may antagonize your opponent because there's a stigma. So what I'm saying is you still need to do it, because, the alternative is if you think a judge needs to be called or whatever. But let's find ways that calling a judge, and then finding ways to call the judge and remove the stigma, right? So let's kind of go over that, right? So let's do a few of those scenarios where the arc can go either way. So there's a few things we can go over later about, like, like as Chris points out, like the more carefully or more often you measure something, the less accurate it's going to be, right? Because of just how we move things.
Yep.
So the only reason I'll ever call an arc check, right, is if I think my opponent and I can't agree, I just want to remove, because so let's say I measure it and I think it's in, and clearly my opponent, and I think it's close enough that my opponent won't believe me, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I don't think it's obvious. I'm going to call the judge so that way they don't have to take my word that it's in, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
And so what I'll say is like, and I'll say something along those lines when I call the judge, like, hey, you know what? Let's just call a judge. You don't have to take my word for it. And I'll add those little modifiers to my statement when I call the judge to try and lighten the reason I'm calling the judge for those kinds of things. Like, and there's a lot of those situations where you can kind of modify it, where it's true too. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. And technically the silent part is also that like you're not taking their word for it, but you don't have to like harp on that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
The key is that they're also not taking your word for it, right? And that can also make them feel better, because you don't also, if you think about this, where you almost, bully's a strong statement, but it's in the same vein of feeling like they really feel it's in or are out, right? And you feel it's like, it's close, it could be in, but like I don't know if it's really in. Well, it's really in, man. Well, it might be, right? But it's really close. And we're gonna have to move all these ships. As soon as I have to start moving a lot of ships and be like, let's just call the judge over, right? Because if I have to move a bunch of ships, it increases the odds we're gonna bump something, right? And as soon as I bump something, so here's the way my attitude is: if I bump a ship, right, it's in, right? Or like it's the one that you need. And that sucks. Now here's the thing: I hold it to my opponent. As soon as you bump it, like, nah, it's what I needed now. Well, no, I don't know. It's like, yeah, but you just completely ruined the games. Like, I mean, I'm really hard on that. Like, hey man, like we can't repair this game state now. Like, and so like I have to be pretty harsh on, like, not harsh, but stern on those kind of boundaries. And so that's another reason why as soon as we start having to really kind of move some stuff, I want the judge over so they can see those things.
Sure.
Right. And again, lighten. You don't have to take my word for it. It's like, we got to move a bunch of stuff. Let's call a judge over. And again, you say it in a light tone. We got to move stuff. This is ways to diffuse the reason you're calling a judge. Because again, I don't think this is a big deal. The key is that plenty of people still get weirded out by calling judges. So it's trying to find modifiers to your statement about calling a judge and kind of like lowering the issue. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I have an example here where you call a judge even on yourself. I don't remember the exact one, but it was that MindLink Worlds. It was my round one opponent, right? And I think he was playing triple jumps. I don't think he was playing a MindLink version. I think anyway, I think the answer was, and I can't remember the exact thing, but it was a MindLink question. I knew all the ins and outs of MindLink. He clearly didn't. Some relatively casual coming to Worlds thing. Sure. I think the issue was like, when you like focus with one dude, everyone gets a focus, and then the next pilot can actually focus and end up with 2 focus tokens, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think he was like, "Oh, you can do that, but you already like." And so I was explaining it to him, and I could see him do the squint of like, sure. Like he was just gonna go with it.
Right.
He was agreeing with me, but I could see he was like kind of like, oh, okay. Like kind of like going along for the ride, but like really uncomfortable with it. I was like, let me just call a judge. He's like, no, you don't have to do that. It's like, dude, you don't have to take my word for this. And I didn't ask him. I just called a judge. Right. Mm-hmm. And he was clearly uncomfortable. I called this judge. But again, I'm calling it on myself. Like I explained this rules interaction, right? And what's going to happen here is if I'm wrong, I lose a focus token, right? Like literally, I'm gaining, I'm throwing, it's MindLink. I'm just dropping focus tokens wherever I want them, right? Do what I want. But my point is he's uncomfortable with it. So I'm just like, look, man, at worst, I lose focus tokens, right? Like I'm calling a judge on here. If I'm wrong, focus tokens disappear from this table. Right? And so I explained to the judge what's going on. Here's what I'm doing. He goes, yep, that's exactly how it works. And my opponent was instantly like, clearly like, he's like relaxed. It's like, cool, thanks,
He
man.
Felt confidence in what you were saying, right?
Yeah, right. And like we had a good, fun game. I mean, it was one-sided, but like he was not. He didn't feel like I was cheating him, right? Because it was clear that he was like, all right, this person's just putting tokens down. Like he has like 8 billion focus tokens. I don't know if that's right. He swears it's right. You know, it's one of those. Here's the thing, man. If there's any opponent you ever have, and like they have some complicated interaction, chances are, again, they're probably correct. Call a judge and make them walk it through. Just be, if you are not sure that that interaction works, just call a judge. Right?
Yep.
And this is, we'll get into the self-advocacy part later because the judge might be incorrect on that. And we'll deal with how to deal with if they're incorrect on what is actually correct. But again, like just, this is the first step, right?
Yeah, it's the first step. And some of it too is like having confidence in the rules, like in that instance specifically. So he obviously didn't feel confident in that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't sure because there's been times like it happened to me at Worlds where Paul LaRue used foresight as a secondary weapon, and I was like, huh, you can do that? And he was like, oh yeah, you can. And later on they changed that ruling, but at first, like, I went into Worlds thinking like you can't, and then he had to explain like I don't even have to spend a force and I can use it as a secondary weapon. And I looked at him and I'm like, you can tell by the way that thing is worded and by the way the card interacts that it is not intended to be done that way. But I had just assumed that that's how the ruling was. I didn't actually know. And I didn't want to argue with him because I was like, you know what? We're on the top tables. This guy's 4-0 just like I am. He probably knows. I mean, he didn't do any damage with it because he shot at an Inquisitor. Go figure. But I was like, at first, I was like, wait, you can do that? Okay. But it was that, like, if we would have called a judge, I would have been fine with it just because I'm more comfortable with them doing that. But I, at that point in time, took his word for it. But in retrospect, I probably should have called a judge and been like, hey, is this true? If you were
at any point uncomfortable, it's to me, it's just like really easy to call a judge over, especially for something that easy. You're not really taking time away from the game. Functionally, like you are if it takes forever to get a judge, but it shouldn't, especially if it's like not an art check. It's like, hey, this, and this. Does that actually work? And in theory, the judge should know the answer to that, right? It shouldn't. I mean, the more complicated it is, but again, we'll talk about time extension some other time. But like, yeah, like I would argue that if you were uncomfortable with that, then you should have just called the judge and be like, hey, is that actually how it works? Like, you know, like, and Paul LaRue shouldn't be offended. Like, my opinion is you just shouldn't have to take your opponent's word that interactions work. Right? Like, it's not that big a deal.
Sure.
That is how foresight works. They ultimately did incorrectly rule it, in my opinion.
I agree with you.
And in FFG's opinion. But, you know, whatever. So anyway.
But I think it's good, though, that we have this conversation because now that conversation's had, you become more aware of it. And once you actually think about it for a second, which maybe you don't normally, it's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And that's part of why I really wanted to try to really echo what you guys had talked about and to drive this home.
Yeah, because I think the feeling is like you're calling Paul LaRue like a liar if you call a judge, right? Like that's the feeling, right? And like, I just feel like I don't have like, and it's just a mentality shift where like, I don't feel like I'm calling Paul LaRue a liar. I'm acknowledging that he can be mistaken. I'm not calling him a liar. I'm acknowledging that it can be incorrect, that we all are infallible, and that might not work the way he thinks it works. And that I also acknowledge. So when it's really obvious, you're like, oh, sure. Like if it's really, but in this case, I agree with you. If I read those cards, it technically works as it works, right? But it does not read that way, right? It is not an obvious reading of that card. I do agree with that, right? So first pass, I go, man, are you sure? It's like, yeah, man, like it doesn't stop me. It's like, oh, so you're going with it doesn't stop me from doing. All right, hold on. Let's just get a judge, right? Let's just get a judge and make sure it doesn't stop me is actually how it works. Because it might. You don't even have to be, it's like, okay, maybe, judge. Again, it's like, and just go, and you can just feign ignorance. Like, it's okay to like, so this is another thing that I do. And for anyone here, I'm very comfortable doing this. I used to do consulting. It's a consulting trick, actually, to go in and just simply what we call feign ignorance of like, I'm not sure how that, I'm not sure I understood you. Can you walk me through it again? Or like, man, I just really didn't get that. Can you tell me again? And I'm shocked at the number of smart people that I meet that are unable to acknowledge that they didn't understand something or even feign that they didn't understand something. So what I'm going to recommend to you, and hopefully your ego can handle it, is simply to say whether this is true or not. I don't get it. And it's saying out loud, I don't get it. Can you tell me again? Is a useful tool to make someone tell you something twice.
Sure.
Or in this case, to call the judge. I'm not sure I really get it. Judge. And what are they going to do? Well, you're an idiot. Then that makes them the asshole, right? Because they're telling you you're an idiot. Like, I guess, and then you just go, I guess I am. I guess I'm too stupid for this. Judge twice. Like, you know what I mean? Like, but I mean, it allows you to save face because you're not calling them a liar. You're not you know what I mean? Like, you're saying you're again, I'm just using any tool in my box to not be confrontational, to not try and hurt someone's ego, right? I'm taking the ego onto myself, right? I'm deflecting it, and I'm doing these tricks to try and make sure everyone's ego is intact and I can just call the judge safely without hurting anyone's feelings, right? And it turns out that he may have actually had that ruling against him, which would have been unfortunate, based on the way the tournament's going. But like Forsyth may not have ruled in his favor that day.
Sure.
But that's a coincidence. Like, it should have been, but like, turns out like he should have actually consulted with the judge ahead of time on purpose, because it's not as obvious as it seems. Like, FFG did in fact need to clarify that, in my opinion.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, and I hadn't even thought about using it that way. So going into Worlds, I never.
Neither
even
did a lot
bothered
of
to
people.
ask.
That's sort of the point. That's why it's worth clarifying.
Yep.
Like another case, we had a case at Nova where a player, it was a upper tier game. It was a first order player versus someone else. Anyway, he had I'll show you the dark side condition. We talked about this on the cast, but it's worth restating. But he had I'll show you the dark side condition applied to someone. Kylo was dying, so he was removing the I'll show you the dark side condition. And his opponent was like, whoa, the condition stays, right? Like, he's like, no, Kylo's dead. He's like, no, like, the condition stays, like, and this, again, his opponent, that's to his opponent's detriment, right? Like, having I'll show you on the dark, which is almost certainly probably like panicked pilot, right? That'll randomly potentially trigger and hurt him. But he's like, no, like, the condition will stay on my ship. You still assigned it. Nothing's removing it. And the first order player was like convinced, like, he also loses the condition. So like the opponent like called the judge basically on himself to like let the first order player know, like, no, really, this stays on the board, man. Like, this, to my detriment, stays here, right? Like, he could have feigned ignorance and purposely let the first order player take the condition off the board for no good reason. But this is, both good etiquette, right? And calling up the judge to clarify something, right? Like, like when someone's like, no, this definitely works. It's like, well, you don't have to take my word for it, right? Judge, this is what's going on. Can you just walk us through what goes on? And then someone gets clarified. Like, oh, I totally thought this was worse off than I thought it was. No, man, it's actually better than you think it is. Neat, thanks. And like Chris was saying, I promise you, even though that first order player lost, I bet you he walked away having a really positive interaction and a positive tournament, right? Because his list is better than he thought it was. He had a positive interaction with his opponent. Was like, hey, man, he could have, like, I might have, in his head, he's like, he probably went through the iterations of accidentally critting that panicked pilot and maybe accidentally winning that game, which is probably not going to happen. But the point is like, this guy was really nice. He made sure the rules worked, right? And then that player played correctly the rest of the tournament, right? Played that list correctly from then on. And it cascades from there. Everyone has a better time. From a judge call. Here's the thing. Everyone had a better time from a judge call. That's the thing that we need to learn from this.
Do you think some of it is also people's frustrations, or sometimes maybe getting an incorrect ruling where they're either afraid because it takes time to get a judge sometimes just to get those quick ones, or because they're like, well, I know I've asked a judge and like they've been wrong, and you can't apply that stigma to everyone. But do you think that might also come into play of why people are less willing to call a judge?
Possibly. The problem is I don't know. I mean, I don't even hear enough stories about judge interactions. I don't feel like people have many. So like, I don't say this phrase much. So like, I don't want to say as like, all right. So as a player that attends more premier events, right? And as someone that's not afraid to call judges, I feel like I typically have far more judge interactions than a typical player, even what you would consider more well-known players. Like, I call judges plenty, right? Arc checks, rules interactions, clarifications. So there's that aspect. I don't know if I see a ton of judge calls, and I don't know how often. I mean, I see them throughout the tournament. I don't know if they're repetitious for same players. So I don't know what that is. I think it's my guess, my hypothesis is ambiguity. Since people don't do it often, they project their fear. Like in the absence of information, people project fears rather than hopes. That's pretty human.
Sure.
Um, so that's sort of where I'm getting at. I don't actually know the answer. Like, it's very possible someone had I mean, I've had negative judge interactions. All right. I've just had so many judge interactions. I understand that that is an outlier rather than a commonality. Right. And I've had it across games, etc. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I hope it's ambiguity, which this sort of discussion across things will hopefully alleviate. Because for the most part, the judges care. Like,
Yeah.
sure, you might have a bad apple, but that's true of everything. For the most part, the judges care. They're there. Like, the judges are not. The few times that judges are being paid, they're not being paid enough.
Yes.
They're doing this stuff because they care. They want you to have a good time.
Right.
Right.
It goes back to the good faith, right? Most judges are
Yeah.
there in good faith because they want to have a good experience and they want to be able to help. Yep.
Right. And so that's the point. Like, they're there to try and do their best to resolve your issues and make sure that everyone walks away to the best of their abilities having a good time. Yes, sometimes it's zero sum. They have to make a ruling in air quotes someone's favor or not, right? In arc check, sometimes it's in or out of arc, and someone's unhappy with that. But still, the idea is they're trying to facilitate games so that people can play games to the best of their abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and everyone has a good tournament. The end. So yeah, so that's generally speaking. I don't know. Is there anything else? I don't know from your aspect. Is there anything else? Like, that's some broad ideas about how to sort of at least initiate judge calls without necessarily, but hitting your opponent, or like trying to diffuse the situation about and destigmatize calling judges. Right.
Yeah.
Anytime I have to move up, anytime that there's an interaction you're uncomfortable with, you can feign ignorance. I mean, you may not have to feign ignorance, right? That's the whole point.
Yep.
But even if you know the interaction and your opponent's just wrong, you can feign ignorance. It's okay to feign ignorance, right?
Yep, it is.
As soon as there's an arc check where you have to move too many things, I would recommend calling a judge, because it's just, man, we're really good at this. We're really used to this, right? Like, you and I play in more games and we bump stuff. And as soon as I bump something, I have ceded the high ground about whether it was in arc or not, or in range or not, right? I have to basically just say, I've ruined the game state. Here, opponent, have what you wanted. And that sucks. I don't want to do that, right? The whole point of this was like, I didn't think you had it, but now I have to basically concede that you probably have it. I mean, you have it now. I've literally said those words a handful of times where I go, well, you got it now, when I bump something, and I go, well, you got it now. I'm like, what? I was like, you have it. I'm going to set it in range because I bumped it. I can't know where it was. So it is in range now. I'm going to set it at range 3, right? Because I thought it was out of range, but I don't know that anymore. I bumped it. It is now in range 3 shoot. They're like, really? I was like, what am I supposed to do? Argue now? I can't ever repair this ever again, right? Like, I would only be an asshole trying to say it's out of range again, unless it was comically out of range, right? Like, if it was something range 4, I'd be like, no, right? But something like, if it was clearly close, I mean, yeah, right? Like, so that's the whole point. When it's real, if I have to move more than one ship or something, I'm probably calling a judge just to watch.
Yep.
Right.
And I've defaulted. So there's two notes I have on that. Like, I have defaulted that if it is close, like if I put the template down and I'm like, this is close, I'll just usually literally say that to them and then say, all right, I'm going to call a judge really quick and just let them decide. And usually your opponents are like, yeah, that is probably close. Like, I don't want to screw this up either. That's fine. The other piece of advice I have, and this is something I think you can actively do more as a player that most people don't think about, is since we have a pretty good community overall, one of the pieces of advice that I can give you is take the time to like actually meet people that are going to judge and just introduce yourself to them, have a brief conversation with them, because you'll feel more comfortable. I mean, I experience this a lot because a lot of the people that judge are either my friends or I know them pretty well. And it feels way less of a intimidation or a stigma if I'm just like, hey, Vic, can you come over and check this arc? I need you to go on that side. Or, hey, Zach, how does this interaction work? And it becomes much more of like a conversation and less of a like official ruling type stance. And I think that helps things flow. And if you can have that rapport with a judge, they're usually much more like casual in their approach, and it eases some of the tension that could happen. And that's something that as a player you can actively do. I'm not saying, go become best friends with everyone, but you can get to know people. You're actively doing that anyway when you go to events and you play. It doesn't hurt to also get to know or meet some of the judges too, if that helps.
I wrote this down. It's worth actually saying out loud, but like the judges are there to provide clarity and provide a neutral third party for disagreements or confusion, right? That's exactly what they're there for, right? The reason they're measuring an arc is because you and your opponent didn't agree on it. Mm-hmm. Right. The reason they're measuring range, you and an opponent didn't agree. The reason they're clarifying something is you and an opponent. That's the reason. It's a neutral, someone that you both agree is a neutral arbiter that will clarify the decision. That's what they're there to provide.
Yep.
So that way, like someone else had to make the ruling rather than like your opponent just like bullying you into a decision.